The morning they brought Shagrol Earthshaker to the Dawson homestead, the sky was the color of a bruise, and every person who lined the road to watch her arrive wore a face carved from the same cold stone. She sat in the back of a territorial commissioner's wagon with her wrists bound by a length of rough hemp rope, not because she was violent. She had not thrown a single blow since the armistice, but because the men escorting her seemed to need the rope more than she did. It made them feel safer. It made them feel like they were in control of something in the aftermath of a war that had taken things from everybody, human and orc alike. Her dark green skin caught the pale early light, and her jaw was set with a quiet, furious dignity that did not crack for a single moment as the wagon rolled through the mud of Thornwell's single main road, past the trading post and the sheriff's office, and the hitching rails where saddle horses turned their soft eyes away from the noise. She was 23 years old and she had been given away like a land parcel. The Treaty of the Thornwell Basin, signed 8 months prior after 3 brutal years of border conflict between the orc clans of the Ashpeak Range and the expanding human settlements of the frontier territories, contained a clause that most delegates had agreed to while exhausted and blood-drained and wanting nothing more than to sleep in their own beds. Article 14. Settlement of outstanding war debts through provision of labor or bond. The human delegates had argued it applied only to mined ore and livestock. The Orc clan elders, under considerable military pressure from the territorial army, had interpreted it as a mandate that certain clan members could be assigned to human households for a period of no less than 2 years, bound by contract, as reparation for border raids the clans themselves had internally contested. It was, by every honest measure, a polished-up form of something shameful. The territorial commissioner called it structured settlement. Most people in Thornwell called it something uglier when they thought no one was listening. Shagrol had been chosen by her clan elders not because she was the least valued among them, but because she was the most stubborn, the one most likely to survive whatever the humans decided to do with her, and the one whose disappearance would cause the least political ripple with the remaining clan alliances. She had been a scout, a hunter, a woman who read weather in the movement of grass and who could dress a deer carcass in 11 minutes, and who had never once in her life been afraid of anything she could see coming. It was the invisible things that had always unsettled her, the things that came wrapped in paperwork. She wore a fitted leather bodice, deep brown and laced tight across her torso with sinew cord, the kind of garment made for movement rather than ceremony, cut to follow the strong lines of her frame. Beneath it, she wore a long-sleeved linen undershirt dyed the dark red of old clay, and her trousers were heavy frontier wool tucked into knee-high leather boots that had seen 100 miles of mountain trail. Her dark hair was pulled back in a series of braided knots, fixed with small polished stones of the kind her mother had used, and a single curved tusk caught the light on her lower left jaw, ivory white and sharp. She was broad-shouldered and powerfully built, not in a way that erased her femininity, but in a way that made her look like someone the frontier itself had assembled, piece by deliberate piece. She was striking in the manner of wild country, not soft, not decorative, but genuinely, undeniably beautiful. Benjamin Dawson stood at the edge of his property line when the wagon came down the fork road toward his homestead, and he was not a man who was easily read. He was 27, lean in the way that outdoor work makes a man lean, with calloused hands and a jaw that needed a shave, and a pair of dark eyes that had seen enough loss to make him quiet in situations where other men ran loud. He had lost his father to the second year of the border war, a man who had nothing to do with the fighting but whose homestead had sat too close to a raid corridor. He had rebuilt the main structure of the farmhouse himself, log by log, in the months after the funeral. He had planted his first crop alone. He had harvested it alone. He had entered his name into the territorial commissioner's labor assignment rolls, not because he wanted a bonded worker, but because he needed farmhand help. and because he had enough practical sense to recognize that the humans who had written Article 14 were going to implement it whether or not anyone with decent judgment signed on. And he had thought with the particular logic of a man who had seen what indecency could do, that it was better for whomever they sent to land with someone who would treat them like a person. He had not anticipated that the person they sent would make his heart do something complicated the moment the wagon stopped. The commissioner's deputy, a round-faced man named Harwick who always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, climbed down from the wagon seat and unrolled a document that flapped in the morning wind. He cleared his throat with theatrical importance. Benjamin Dawson, registered homestead, Thornwell Basin, Lot 47. Per Article 14 of the Thornwell Treaty, one orc bondswoman, registered as Shagrol of the Earthshaker clan, is hereby assigned to your property for a term of 24 months, beginning this date. She is obligated to provide agricultural and domestic labor for the duration of said term, in exchange for housing, food, and minimal wage to be held in trust by the territorial office. He lowered the paper and looked at Benjamin with the expression of a man handing off a problem he was glad to no longer personally manage. You'll need to sign here. Benjamin did not move toward the paper immediately. He was looking at Shagrol, who had not looked at him yet. She was staring at a point somewhere past his shoulder, at the farmhouse and the barn and the broad flat fields behind it, reading the land the way he had seen experienced scouts read terrain, making her calculations quietly and without any visible panic. He signed the paper. Then he walked to the back of the wagon and held his hand out toward her. Not to help her down, she was plainly capable, but to offer. She looked at his hand for a long moment before she looked at his face, and whatever she was searching for there, she must have found enough of it, because she placed her bound wrists in his palm and he turned to Harwick. "Cut the rope," Benjamin said. Harwick blinked. Procedure dictates she remain restrained until the receiving party has confirmed. "Cut the rope, Harwick." The deputy looked at the small cluster of Thornwell residents who had followed the wagon out of morbid curiosity and found no particular support among them for either position, and then he unfolded his belt knife and cut the rope. Shagrol rubbed her wrists once, a single unsentimental gesture, and climbed down from the wagon without accepting Benjamin's offered hand, but also without putting any particular hostility into the refusal. She landed on the ground of the homestead and straightened to her full height, which brought her to nearly Benjamin's eye level, and she looked at the farmhouse again and then at him. "I am Shagrol Earthshaker," she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected and unhurried, and it carried the faint formal cadence of someone who had learned human speech as a second language and learned it thoroughly. "Not a debt, not a bondswoman. I am here because my elders required it, and I will not dishonor them by running, but I will be spoken to plainly, and I will be told exactly what is expected. I am not a servant." There were a few sounds from the watching townspeople. A man near the trading post fence made a noise that was not quite a word. Benjamin turned to look at the small crowd with an expression that was not angry but was very specifically final, the kind of look that communicated clearly that the show was over and everyone should consider themselves dismissed. Several people found reasons to be elsewhere. He turned back to Shagrol. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll be plain. I have 40 acres to farm, a barn that needs new roofing on the east side, winter stores to put up before first frost, and no one to help me do any of it. I live alone. The house has 2 rooms. You can have the back one. There's no lock on your door from the outside, and there won't be one. You eat what I eat. You work hard, and I'll work hard alongside you. If something about what I'm asking isn't right, you tell me and we'll figure it out. And I meant what I said to Harwick. You don't owe me anything. The treaty signed papers. Papers aren't people. You're a person." Shagrol looked at him for a long, still moment. The wind moved through the grass of the field behind him. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called twice and then fell quiet. "Your crops," she said at last. "What are you growing?" "Winter wheat on the main field, root vegetables in the kitchen plot." I was trying to figure out if the north slope gets enough sun for a second planting before frost. She turned and looked at the north slope with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent years reading what land could and could not yield. It does not. Not for wheat. But if you were to plant a cold, hardy legume there, something like a black-eyed pea variant, you would get a harvest before the freeze, and you would improve the soil for next season. Benjamin looked at the north slope and then back at her. I didn't know that. Most humans who farm this basin do not, she said, without any particular smugness in it. The Ashbeak clans have been gardening these foothills for 4 generations. The soil has patterns, he nodded. Then I guess we both have something to learn from each other. She did not smile, but something behind her eyes shifted just slightly, like a door that had been bolted from the inside being cautiously unlatched a single degree. The first week was careful. They existed in the same space with the deliberate courtesy of 2 people navigating around something fragile, each aware of the other's presence at all times without making a production of it. Shagrol rose before dawn every morning. Benjamin discovered this because he rose before dawn himself, and she was always already outside, standing at the edge of the kitchen garden in the gray pre-light, reading the overnight changes in the soil and the growth with her hands and her eyes in a way that he found oddly moving to watch through the window. She learned the layout of the homestead faster than he had learned it himself when his father had first built it, and she moved through it with an efficiency that was never hurried but was always purposeful. He showed her the barn that first afternoon, the east roof, where the boards had warped and let in water, the 3 milk cows and their particular personalities, the pair of plow horses named Thomas and Crane, who were brothers and deeply suspicious of strangers. Crane snapped at Shagrol's sleeve the first time she reached for his bridle, and she did not flinch back but simply held her ground and let him smell her hand until his ears came forward, and within 10 minutes she was scratching behind his ears, and he was making the low, satisfied rumble that Benjamin had never heard him make for anyone other than himself. "He reminds me of my youngest brother," Shagrol said. "Suspicious of everything new, impossible to dislike once he trusts you." It was the first personal thing she had said. Benjamin stored it with the careful attention of a man who understands that personal things offered early in a situation like this one were not offered lightly. The townspeople of Thornwell had opinions. They had opinions loudly and frequently, and mostly in the direction of Benjamin's ears whenever he came to the trading post or the tavern to collect supplies. Old man Farrett, who ran the hardware exchange, asked him whether he was worried about sleeping under the same roof. A woman named Millie Crane, who was unrelated to the horse, told him she hoped he knew what he was getting into. The sheriff, a fair-minded man named Cade Ostrander who had lost his own brother in the border war but managed to carry that loss without letting it turn him to stone, stopped Benjamin on the road one afternoon and said quietly that he was keeping an eye on things, which Benjamin understood to mean he was watching out for trouble in both directions, the kind that might come from Shagrol and the kind that might come for her. Benjamin thanked him and meant it for only one of those things. Shagrol knew, of course, how she was perceived. She knew it with the absolute cellular certainty of someone who had been perceived that way her entire life and who had learned, because she had no other practical option, to let the knowing move through her without destroying her. She did not go into Thornwell in those first weeks. She did not need to. Everything she required came from the homestead or from what Benjamin brought back, and she was not ready to stand in a road and feel the weight of a town's fear pressing on her ribs. She needed to find her footing first. She needed to know the land she was standing on. The land helped. The Thornwell Basin foothills were different from the high Ashbeak country she had grown up in, but they had a related grammar. The way the wind shifted before rain, the way certain birds moved through the tree line at dusk, the way the soil changed color as you walked from one microslope to another. She understood this land in a way that was rooted and real and did not depend on anyone's opinion of her, and she found her early morning time outside, before the day's work began, to be the most stabilizing part of her existence in those first weeks. She also found herself noticing Benjamin Dawson in ways she had not anticipated and was not entirely comfortable with. He was not what she had expected. She had built a mental picture of whoever the territory would assign her to, and it had been composed of the various human men she had encountered during and after the war: settlers who looked at her like a problem, soldiers who looked at her like a threat, treaty officials who looked at her like a line item in a column. Benjamin looked at her like a person who was interesting. Not in the way that made her feel like a curiosity or a specimen, but in the way that one genuinely skilled person recognizes another with a kind of quiet respect that had to be earned and was being offered in advance, on credit, with the clear expectation that it would eventually be confirmed. He worked hard, harder than she had expected from a man living alone, which told her that he had always worked this hard, that it was not a performance for her benefit. He was up every day before the light with a clear plan, and he executed the plan with a focused competence that she appreciated viscerally. He also knew when to ask for help, which was rarer than competence and more valuable. By the third day, he was asking her opinion about things: where to position the new fence posts, whether the eastern field needed lime before the winter planting, what she thought about the angle of the barn's secondary water channel. And he listened to what she said. Not in the performative way that some humans listen to orcs, pretending to hear while mentally discounting, but actually listened, thought it over, and more often than not did the thing she suggested. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the kitchen garden entirely, introduced the black-eyed pea planting on the north slope, and repaired 3 sections of the east barn roof, while Benjamin ripped out the worst of the warped boards and handed up new ones. They worked side by side on the roof in a comfortable silence broken occasionally by necessity and the easy back and forth of people figuring out a shared task. And at one point, when a board slipped, and she caught it one-handed before it could fall and take Benjamin's knee with it, he looked at her with an expression of such unguarded gratitude and relief that she felt something warm shift in her chest and looked away quickly toward the middle distance of the fields. She told herself it was the exertion. The incident in Thornwell happened at the end of the third week, when Benjamin had run low on lamp oil and flour, and she had offered, because she was tired of feeling like she needed to hide inside the property line, to go with him to the trading post. He had said yes without making it a thing, and they had gone together in the wagon with Thomas pulling at a comfortable walk and the autumn air carrying the first real edge of approaching cold. The trading post was busy that afternoon. A supply train had come through from the south, and half the basin settlers were in to collect parcels and negotiate prices, and the road outside the trading post was thick with wagons and horses, and people talking in the loud, overlapping way of a gathering. Shagrol climbed down from the wagon beside Benjamin, and the noise shifted. It did not stop exactly, but it changed its texture, the way a flock of birds changes direction when something moves through the tree line, all individual adjustments that produced a collective swerving away. She walked beside Benjamin into the trading post, and people moved. Not violently, not with any explicit threat, but the space around her was maintained by a constant low-level adjustment, as though she were a large stone dropped into a human stream, and the current was simply redirecting. Old Man Farrett looked up from behind his counter, and his face did the thing faces do when the brain is deciding between an automatic reaction and a more considered one. The considered one won by a slim margin. He said Dawson, and left the second name off, which communicated clearly that he was not sure what to call the other person present, and Shagrol found this so perfectly illustrative of the entire situation that she almost laughed. Almost. The real problem came from outside. A man named Garrick Sell, who ran a small cattle operation 2 properties north of Benjamin's, and who had 3 cousins who had died in border raids during the second year of the war, was standing with 2 of his ranch hands near the hitching rail when they came back out. Garrick was the kind of man who carried his grief like a weapon, looking for soft places to drive it in. He had a hard, angular face and a voice that carried. "Dawson," he called across the road, making no pretense of the fact that his eyes were fixed on Shagrol. "You know what you're doing, bringing that into town." Benjamin stopped walking. He did not look at Garrick right away. He set the flour sack he was carrying into the wagon bed with particular care, straightened, and then turned to face the other man across the road. "That has a name," Benjamin said. He spoke clearly enough to carry. Several people nearby heard it and their postures changed. "And she is standing right here." Garrick stepped off the trading post porch and came across the road with the deliberate swagger of a man who was used to being the heaviest thing in a room, his ranch hands bracketing him on either side. He stopped about 8 feet from Benjamin and spread his feet apart, which was the frontier equivalent of drawing a line in the soil. "I lost 3 family to her kind," he said. 3. "You're going to walk her through town like she belongs here." "She does belong here," Benjamin said. "Same as you, same as me. Don't you put us in the same sentence." Shagrol was standing at Benjamin's shoulder. She had not moved back and she was not going to. Her jaw was set in the way it had been set in the commissioner's wagon, that carved and absolute dignity, and her eyes were on Garrick's cell with the clear, unafraid directness of someone who had looked at more frightening things than this and survived them. She felt the tension in the air between the two men like a rope pulled taut, and she made a quiet internal calculation about what was going to happen next and what she was and was not willing to allow. "I am sorry for your family," she said, directing the words at Garrick in a measured, deliberate voice. "Sincerely. Grief of that kind is real and I will not dismiss it." Garrick looked at her as though the ground had spoken to him. "But I did not kill them," she continued. "And I will not carry guilt for it any more than you carry guilt for what the Territorial Army did in the Ashpeak foothills in the summer of the 2nd year. I know what happened there. I lost family too, Garrick Sell. We have that in common, if nothing else." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before it. Something in it had shifted, not resolved, not healed, but moved, like a stone that has been sitting in one position so long everyone forgot it was possible to move it, and then someone does. One of Garrick's ranch hands put a hand on his arm. "Come on, boss," the man said quietly. "Let it go." Garrick looked at Benjamin for a long moment, and something complicated moved through his face, and then he turned and walked back across the road and did not look at either of them again. Benjamin exhaled slowly beside her. His shoulder had been nearly touching hers during the whole confrontation, and now, as the tension dissolved, she was acutely aware of the warmth of that proximity, the solid reality of him having stood there without a half-step back, without flinching, without negotiating her sideways out of his position. "You did not have to say that," he said quietly as they climbed back into the wagon. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her sidelong as Thomas began to pull. "You were incredible." She looked at the road ahead. "Do not make me blush," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was definitely its immediate neighbor. The autumn deepened, and the work of the homestead deepened with it. There was a rhythm now between them that had not existed in those first careful days, a natural alignment of effort and attention that made the long working days feel like something other than labor. They fell into an unspoken schedule: mornings on the fields, midday for the livestock and equipment, afternoons for the preservation work that the approaching winter demanded, evenings for eating together at the plain wooden table in the kitchen, and talking in the way that people talk when they have spent a day working toward a shared purpose and have things to say about it. The talking was its own kind of revelation for both of them. He told her about his father, one evening in October when the first real frost had painted the kitchen window, and the lamp on the table was the warmest thing in the room. He told it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man tells a thing he has had to live with for long enough that the edges have worn smooth, and she listened without interrupting, which was the kind of listening he had not had since before his father died. He told her about building the farmhouse back up, about the first winter alone, about the specific quality of silence that a house acquires when the person who built it is gone. She told him about the ashbeak, about what the high country looked like in the morning, when mist sat in the valley below the clan camp, and everything above it was sharp and brilliant and cold. About her mother, who had been a healer and a herbalist of considerable reputation among the clans, who had died not in the war but of a common fever when Shagrol was 15, and whose death had made Shagrol into a different kind of person than the one she would otherwise have been, harder in some ways, more self-reliant, but also more attentive to the fragile things in the world, the things that could be lost quietly without anyone noticing in time. About her brother, the suspicious one, whose name was Groth and who had a laugh like a boulder rolling downhill and who had wept openly when they brought the assignment papers to the clan camp and Shagrol's name was on them. "He will be all right," Benjamin said. "He knows how to take care of himself," she agreed. "That does not mean he is not worried." "Are you worried about him?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am worried that he will do something rash if he thinks I am being mistreated. He is a strong-feeling person who lacks, sometimes, the patience to wait and see." Benjamin nodded. "Should I write to him?" "The Territorial Commissioner's office has a relay system. I could send word that things are decent here." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, and something in her chest performed the same small, unlocking motion she had felt on the barn roof, except this time it was larger and less deniable. "You would do that?" "Of course. He cannot read human script. Can anyone in his camp who can read it relay the message to him?" She thought for a moment. "There is a woman, an elder named Vasha, who reads both scripts. She translates for the clan when necessary. Then I'll address it to Vasha and ask her to pass it along to Shagrol Earthshaker. I'll tell him you're healthy, you're being treated decently, and that the homestead is a reasonable place to be, and that you're doing work that matters." Shagrol set her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Her tusks caught the lamp light. When she looked up, her expression had the raw, unguarded quality of someone who has not been caught being moved in a long time. "Thank you, Benjamin," she said. He had never heard his full name in her voice before. She had called him Dawson when she referred to him in a third-person way, and had mostly avoided direct address. His name in her voice sounded like something he wanted to hear again as soon as possible, which was a thought he filed away with some alarm, and did not examine for several days. He wrote the letter that night after she went to her room, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, and the frost deepening outside, composing his words with the care of a man writing to someone whose opinion of him would matter considerably to the woman sleeping in the room down the hall. November came with force. The north wind arrived ahead of schedule and with serious intent, and the work shifted to winter preparation with its particular urgency. Firewood stacked in serious quantities against the side of the house, root vegetables brought in and cellared, the livestock brought into the barn's warmer interior sections, the water barrel insulated, and the window gaps chinked. They worked in the cold with their breath making small clouds and their hands reddening inside their gloves, and the physical effort of it created its own warmth between them, the specific intimacy of two people pushing against the same hard thing at the same time. One afternoon in the second week of November, Shagrol was on the woodpile splitting logs and Benjamin was stacking what she split, and she paused with the axe and turned her face into the wind for a moment with her eyes closed, in the way she did when she was reading something in the weather. "Snow tonight," she said. "Heavy. You should bring Thomas and Crane into the barn this afternoon, not wait until evening." He looked up at the sky, which was overcast but did not, to his eyes, look dramatically more threatening than the usual November overcast. "You're sure?" She opened her eyes and looked at him with the patient expression of someone who has been sure about something and knows it. "The wind shifted 6 degrees south in the last hour. The clouds have a particular density at the eastern edge. In the Ashbeak we called this kind of sky a burial sky. We always brought the animals in." He trusted her. He brought the horses in at midday. And that night the heaviest snow the Thornwell Basin had seen in 4 years fell in 3 feet of white silence. And in the morning the world was transformed into something simultaneously beautiful and serious. And Thomas and Crane were warm and comfortable in the barn. And Benjamin stood on the porch looking at the snow-covered fields with the particular satisfaction of a man who listened to the right person at the right time. Shagrol appeared beside him on the porch with 2 cups of hot tea. She had introduced him to a particular blend of dried plants she had brought in a small pouch from the Ashbeak camp, something her mother had made, that tasted like pine and something sweet, and something underneath that he could not name but that felt warming in a way that went past the physical. She pressed 1 cup into his hands without ceremony and stood beside him looking at the white fields. "You called it perfectly," he said. "My mother taught me to read weather before she taught me to read words," she said. He looked at her profile in the cold morning light, the strong line of her jaw, the ivory curve of her tusk, the dark braids with their polished stones catching the low winter sun, and felt a sensation in his chest that he had been carefully not naming for several weeks, and that was becoming increasingly difficult not to name. "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable," he said. Shagrol looked at the fields. "She was the best person I have ever known," she said simply. "I think about her every day." "She would be proud of you," he said, and he meant it straightforwardly, without decoration, and she heard it that way and did not dismiss it or deflect it as she might have 2 months ago, but simply stood with it for a moment, letting it be true. The snow-locked weeks of deep November created a different kind of closeness between them by sheer physical logic. The cold outside made the inside of the farmhouse the center of their world, and they spent long evenings close to the kitchen hearth after the animals were settled, and the day's insulated tasks were done. The fire between them and the dark outside the frost-rimed windows, and they talked more deeply and more freely than they might have with the wide summer fields as a backdrop. He told her about a girl he had been fond of before the war, a settler's daughter who had moved east when the raids began and who he had not heard from since, and how he had eventually stopped expecting to, and how loneliness had become so familiar a companion that he had stopped noticing it as loneliness, and had started thinking of it simply as the baseline condition of his existence. She told him that she had been promised to a man of her clan, years ago, a scout named Dorak who had been killed in the war's first year, and that she had grieved him for his bravery and his humor and the specific way he had laughed at her when she was being too serious, and that she had not been promised to anyone since and had not expected to be, because the war had reshuffled everything and the clan's priorities had narrowed to survival, and then to the complicated aftermath of peace. "Does it feel like peace?" he asked. "What's come after?" She considered this carefully, looking at the fire. "Parts of it," she said. "Not this part, not the Article 14 part." She glanced at him briefly. "Parts of it feel like something better than I expected." He did not look away when her eyes found his. The fire moved between them. Outside, the snow pressed its deep, silent weight against the walls of the farmhouse. And inside, the distance that had been maintained by mutual caution and mutual respect was undergoing a slow, irreversible transformation into something else, something that neither of them had planned for, and both of them were beginning to feel with a considerable clarity that was equal parts terrifying and right. He reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his. He did it simply, without preamble or announcement, in the natural way of someone whose body has come to a conclusion before their mind has finished writing the argument for it. His hand was warm from the fire and rough from the work, and hers was warm and strong and still, and neither of them moved for a long moment. "Benjamin," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "What do you know? That this isn't simple. Nothing about this situation was ever simple." "No," he agreed. "But some of it has been good, the parts with you in them." She turned her hand under his so that their palms were together, and their fingers could intertwine if they chose, and she left the choice open in the air between them. He laced his fingers with hers. Her hand was larger than most women's hands he had held, strong and sure, and he thought it was the finest thing he had ever held on to. "You are a very strange man, Benjamin Dawson," she said, but her voice had changed in a way that made the word strange mean something entirely other than its ordinary meaning. "You're the first person who's made me feel like less strange and more like myself," he said, "in a long time." She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes that had always seen clearly, and in the firelight she was so beautiful that it sat in his chest like a physical weight. She looked at him, and she let herself look, for the first time without the protective gauze of her early wariness, and what she found in his face was exactly what she had been quietly afraid she might find, because it changed things irrevocably to find it, and yet she was not afraid. She was something closer to certain. She leaned forward in her chair. He leaned forward in his. The fire threw gold across both of them. Their first kiss was not tentative. It had been too long arriving to be tentative. It was warm and quiet and sure. The kind of kiss that is less like a question and more like a confirmation of something both parties have known for some time, but have been waiting for the right moment to say aloud in the only language that fully serves the purpose. She kissed him back fully, her free hand rising to his jaw, and he brought his other hand up to her face with a tenderness that made something in her finally, completely release, some last-held thing that she had carried tensed for weeks, for months, for longer than that. They broke apart and stayed close, foreheads nearly touching, his hands still at her face. Outside the snow fell on. The fire settled and crackled softly. "This complicates things," she said softly. "Does it? I am technically assigned to this homestead for another 17 months. I'm aware of the timeline. So this would be whatever you want it to be," he said. "On your terms, at your pace. I'm not the kind of man who confuses a situation with a permission." She pulled back enough to see him fully. "No," she said quietly. "You are not that kind of man. That is the problem." "Is it a problem?" "It is becoming less of one by the minute," she admitted. He smiled, and it transformed his face in a way she had not seen before, wide and unguarded and warm, and she felt it in her sternum like a bell struck. She laughed quietly, just a breath of sound, and shook her head, and they stayed there in the firelight with their hands still joined, while the winter night pressed itself against the walls of the homestead and was entirely unable to get in. The deepest winter brought its hardships in the practical way of deep winters everywhere on the frontier. A section of the barn roof that had seemed sound came down under a heavy ice load in January, and the two of them worked in brutal cold for 2 days to shore it up and get the animals back into safe shelter, working side by side in the icy dark, with lanterns hung from the remaining beams and their breath visible in the light. They developed, during those 2 days, the wordless efficiency of people who know each other's movements well enough to compensate for them instinctively. And when the last board was nailed and the animals were resettled, and they came back into the house half frozen and entirely exhausted, Shagrol set water to heat and made her mother's tea, and they sat together close on the kitchen bench and drank it with their shoulders pressed together, and the warmth coming back slowly into their bodies. She fell asleep on his shoulder before the tea was finished, and he stayed very still so as not to wake her, looking at the ceiling of the kitchen and listening to the house breathe around them, feeling more deeply at rest than he had felt in years. When she woke, she did not immediately move. She was aware of where she was, and she chose, deliberately, to remain there for a moment, her head on his shoulder and his arm that had at some point moved around her, holding her loosely in the unconscious protective way of someone asleep, and she let herself have the particular comfort of it before the day required them both to be upright again. "How long was I asleep?" she said into his collar. "Long enough that my left arm is somewhat asleep too," he said, voice rough from his own half-doze. "But I wasn't going to mention it." She lifted her head and looked at him with expression made soft by sleep and warmth and the remnants of the exhaustion of the past 2 days. He looked back at her in the same state, and in the morning light from the kitchen window they were very close and fully aware of it, and not at all bothered by that fact. And she kissed him again in the unhurried way of a person who has decided there is no longer a reason not to. And he pulled her properly close and kissed her back with his whole attention. They spent the rest of the winter learning each other in the slow, patient way of people who have all the time they need and choose to use it wisely. The physical closeness between them built in small increments, each one chosen and deliberate. The hand he left at the small of her back when they moved through the barn together in the mornings. The way she rested her feet in his lap in the evenings by the fire without asking, and he covered them with a blanket without being asked. The night in February when the cold was so severe that the fire could only do so much, and she appeared in the doorway of his room in the dark and said, practically and without drama, that two people generated more heat than one, and he moved over in the bed and she lay down beside him, and they slept curled against each other like two things made to fit, which they were coming to strongly suspect they were. By March, when the first thaw moved through the basin and the ground began to soften toward the possibility of new planting, they were fully and entirely in love in the way that the word is at its most serious. Not the dazzled, destabilizing love of the beginning, but the kind that has had time to get its roots down, that has been tested by cold and labor and fear and proximity, and has only grown more certain in each of those tests. He looked at her and felt the clean, settled certainty of a man who has found the right thing and knows it. She looked at him and felt, for the first time since her mother died, the particular safety of someone who understood the whole of her and chose her anyway, tusk and green skin and ashbeak accent and stubborn, careful heart and all. Garrick Sell tried one more time. On a clear, cold March morning when the snow was melting off in patches, and the road was mud and Benjamin had gone to Thornwell alone to negotiate seed prices for the spring planting, Garrick came to the homestead on horseback with one of his ranch hands. Shagrol was in the kitchen garden assessing the winter damage when she heard the horses on the approach road and straightened to meet them. Garrick pulled up and looked down at her from the saddle. He had a piece of paper in his hand, which he held out toward her with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has found a leverage point. Commissioner's office put out a clarification on Article 14, he said. Bonded workers aren't permitted to alter the use or planting arrangements of assigned properties without the registered homesteader's written authorization. You planted that north slope with legumes in violation of terms. That's a petition for reassignment. He smiled at her with something that was not warmth. I've already put my name in for a transfer request. You'd be working my cattle operation by April. Shagrol looked at him steadily. That document is real, she said. Commissioner Hartley signed it last month. She did not show him anything on her face. She turned and walked into the house and came back out with a folded piece of paper which she held up toward Garrick. This is a letter, she said, written in November by Benjamin Dawson and signed by him, authorizing, and I quote, all agricultural modifications proposed by Shagrol Earthshaker to be considered approved at her discretion, as she possesses superior knowledge of the basin's soil and planting conditions. Signed and dated. The Commissioner's office has a copy. Garrick stared at the paper. Something moved across his face in the way of water hitting rock impact, then dispersal, then reluctant finding of another course. You couldn't have known about the clarification before he wrote that, Garrick said. No, she agreed. He wrote it because he trusted my judgment, not because he was anticipating your petition. She lowered the paper. I am not going to your cattle operation, Garrick Sell. I am staying on this homestead, and in the spring I am going to make it yield better than it has in 20 years, and there is nothing in any document the Commissioner's office has issued that changes that. You may take your transfer request and ride home. The ranch hand beside Garrick made a quiet sound that was possibly suppressed amusement. Garrick looked at Shagrol for a long moment with an expression that was cycling through several things, and then he turned his horse and rode out, and Shagrol stood in the muddy kitchen garden and watched him go, and allowed herself one long, slow exhale. When Benjamin came home that afternoon and she told him what had happened, he set down his supply bags on the kitchen table and looked at her with an expression of pure, uncomplicated admiration. "You handled that on your own," he said. "I did," she said. "It is good practice." "Practice for what?" She met his eyes. "For being a person who belongs somewhere," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her face in his hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that left very little room for any remaining doubt about how he felt. And she held him back with her strong hands at his shoulders and kissed him back with equal certainty. And outside, the spring mud of the thaw was doing its long, necessary work of making the ground ready for new things. Spring arrived in earnest, and with it came a letter. It arrived in the Thornwell mail relay from the Commissioner's Northern Office, addressed to Benjamin Dawson, and the handwriting on the outer wrapping was large and painstaking and unfamiliar. Inside was a single sheet of coarse paper, and the writing on it was in Orcish script, and at the bottom, in a second hand, a neat, small, precise human script was a translation. It read, "To the human man Dawson at Lot 47, Thornwell Basin. My sister says you are decent. I do not trust easily, but I have chosen to trust this because she does not say such things without reason. If you make her regret trusting you, I will find you. I do not say this as a threat. I say it as information. Her name means earth and force together. Treat her like both. Groth Earthshaker by way of Elder Vasha." Benjamin read it twice and then propped it against the kitchen lamp, where it remained for the rest of the spring. "Your brother has a gift for correspondence," he told Shagrol. "He spent a long time composing that," she said, studying it. "You can tell by the care and the symbols. He is not a careful man by nature. He worked at this. It means he's thinking about you. It means he is afraid for me, and this is how he manages it," she said softly, and then looked at Benjamin. "Write him back." "Already started," he said. "The spring planting was the best work of the homestead's recent history. With the North Slope legumes from the previous autumn having improved the soil's nitrogen content exactly as Shagrol had predicted, and with her knowledge of the basin's particular hydrological patterns informing their irrigation choices, and with both of them working together from the first thaw through the last frostrisk of late April, with the clear-eyed focus of people invested in a shared future, the fields went in beautifully. The winter wheat germinated strong. The kitchen garden tripled its effective yield with better layout. Benjamin bought 2 additional acres from the Territorial Land Office, using the savings he had accumulated over the winter, and Shagrol organized the extension, planting herself with such confident competence that even old man Farrett at the trading post, when Benjamin came in for fertilizer and mentioned the new acreage, said grudgingly that whoever was running his operations growing side seemed to know what they were doing. Benjamin had said pleasantly, "Her name is Shagrol Earthshaker, and yes, she does." Farrett had looked at the counter for a moment and then said, with the particular stiffness of a man fighting his own prejudice and mostly losing, "She's welcome to come in herself then, if she needs supplies." It was not warm, but it was movement, and on the frontier movement was what there was. The first time Shagrol came into Thornwell alone, not with Benjamin, not under the shelter of his presence, was in early May on a Tuesday to collect a seed order from the trading post. She wore her leather bodice and her clay-red shirt and her boots, and she walked down the main road with her chin level and her eyes forward, and she was aware of every pair of eyes that moved to her as she passed. She went into the trading post. Farrett was behind the counter, and a woman and a small boy were at the dry goods shelves. The woman tensed when Shagrol entered. The small boy looked up with the unguarded curiosity of children who have not yet learned what to be afraid of and stared at her tusk with open fascination. "You have a tooth on your face," the boy said. "2, actually," Shagrol said and showed him both. He was delighted. His mother pulled him closer with a nervous hand, but did not take him out of the store, which was itself a kind of progress. Farrett processed her order with minimal conversation and maximum efficiency, which was approximately the level of social warmth he extended to everyone, and she left with the seeds and walked back up the road and loaded the wagon and drove home. And when she got back to the homestead, Benjamin was finishing the afternoon's fence repair, and she drove up and stopped, and he looked up at her. "How was it?" he asked. "A child complimented my tusks," she said. High praise. I thought so, she agreed, and climbed down from the wagon, and he walked over and put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood there for a moment looking at the fields in the late afternoon light, the green of the early crops just beginning to show at the field's surface like a promise the earth was starting to keep. Summer came and the crops grew, and the homestead was the best version of itself that it had been since Benjamin's father had built it. They worked together with the wholehearted investment of people who are building something they care about, something that belongs to both of them in the way that matters more than any paper arrangement. They swam in the creek that ran along the southern property boundary on the hot days of July, and she showed him how to read the creek's depth from its surface color, and he showed her which bends held trout. They drove to the Thornwell summer market together and sold root vegetables and preserved goods from the cellar, and she negotiated 3 price agreements that netted them 30% more than Benjamin had historically gotten for the same goods, and he watched her work with an expression of such transparent pride that she eventually told him to stop looking at her like that before he embarrassed them both, and he grinned and did not stop. Sheriff Ostrander stopped them on the road home from the summer market, and his expression was more open than it had ever been when directed toward Shagrol. "Word's getting around," he said, "that Dawson's operation is putting out the best yield in the basin this year. People are starting to pay attention." "People can pay attention to the wheat," Shagrol said. "That is what it is there for." Ostrander looked at her and then at Benjamin with a small, genuine smile. "You two are something," he said, and rode on. Late July brought a night that became, between them, a kind of touchstone, something they returned to in memory later, the way one returns to a place where something finally became clear. It was a warm night, genuinely warm, the kind that the Thornwell Basin produced maybe 6 or 7 times a summer, where the temperature stayed high past midnight, and the stars were extraordinary, and the darkness smelled of warm grass and the particular dry-sweet scent of a ripening grain field. They had stayed out past their usual hour, sitting on the porch step with the lamp unlit because the stars provided enough, talking about something, about one of Groth's recent letters, which had become warmer and longer and more personal over the course of their spring correspondence, and about what it might mean if the treaty's Article 14 was challenged in the coming year by a delegation of Orc elders who had retained a territorial advocate. At some point the conversation turned and thinned toward something that was less about words and more about the night itself and the way they were sitting together, close and warm, her shoulder against his arm, his hand having moved at some point to find hers on the step between them. "What will you do," he said quietly, "if the Article 14 challenge succeeds, if they dissolve the bondswoman contracts?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "What do you mean, what will I do?" "I mean, will you go back to the Ashpeak?" She turned to look at him, and in the starlight his face was open in the way it was when he was afraid of something and trying not to perform around the fear. She had come to love this particular quality of his vulnerability, the way he showed her his fears as a form of respect, trusting her to hold them carefully. "Benjamin," she said, "I am not asking you to stay out of obligation," he said quickly. "I need you to know that. This place, what we have here, none of it is conditional on any treaty or any paper. If you want to go home, I will help you get there." "Benjamin," she said again, more firmly, and he stopped talking. "I am not in this homestead because of Article 14 anymore," she said. "I stopped being here because of Article 14 approximately 6 months ago. I am here because of you. Because of the fields we planted together and the horses who trust me and the letter from Groth sitting on your kitchen lamp. Because this is the first place I have lived as a person who is fully seen, and that is yours to take credit for, whether you want to or not." She held his gaze steadily, letting every word land precisely where she meant it. "I am not going anywhere I have not chosen. I choose here. I choose you." He looked at her for a long moment with something moving through his face that was too large for any single word to hold, and then he brought their joined hands up and pressed his lips to the back of her hand with a tenderness that was almost reverential, and she felt it move through her like warm water. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." He laughed softly at that, the response catching him pleasantly sideways, and then he pulled her close and she went, settling against him under the extraordinary stars with the ripening grain field breathing its warm scent around them, and the night held them both without any particular commentary. They came inside eventually, and the lamp they lit in the bedroom was the warmest light in the world, and the night gave itself over to the particular intimacy of two people who have been navigating carefully toward each other for a long time and have finally, fully arrived. There was nothing hurried about it and nothing withheld. Only the honest meeting of two people whose bodies and hearts had been building toward each other through cold winters and hard work and careful honesty, and the slow, brave act of trusting. And the night was something she thought, afterward, she would keep inside her for the rest of her life, the particular sense of being completely known and completely wanted. And the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of his voice, saying her name in the dark, as though it were the most precious thing he had ever said. In the morning the fields were still there, the grain still growing, and Thomas and Crane were waiting at the barn door for their morning feeding with their customary impatient dignity, and everything was exactly as it had been the day before and also entirely different. August brought the grain harvest, and it was the best harvest Lot 47 had produced in a decade. Other settlers noticed. 2 homestead families from the basin's north end came to buy seed stock from their surplus. A woman named Petra Aldes, who ran a small herb and remedy operation, came to ask Shagrol specifically about the soil improvement legume method, having heard about it through Farrett, and they spent 2 hours talking in the kitchen garden about growing techniques, with Petra taking careful notes and Shagrol speaking with the comfortable authority of someone who has mastered her subject and enjoys sharing it. And by the end of it, Petra Aldes was looking at her with the open admiration of one competent woman for another, and she came back 2 weeks later with a pot of honey from her own bees as a thank you, which she presented to Shagrol at the door with a directness that was its own kind of. "Respect, you're changing how people think around here," Benjamin told her one evening after Petra had gone. "I am teaching them things that work," Shagrol said. "People tend to think better of what teaches them something useful." "You're doing more than that," he said. "You're making them see you." "They see me because I am standing here," she said simply. "That part is not complicated." "It is complicated," he said gently. "You just make it look otherwise." She considered him across the table. "I learned that from my mother," she said. She said the most powerful thing an orc woman could do in a world that doubted her was to be absolutely excellent at something undeniably useful and to refuse to apologize for it. She was right. She was right about most things. Shagrol looked at her tea. "I think she would have liked you." He was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of that gift before he said, "I hope so. I would very much have liked her." September brought news from the Territorial Commissioner's office that arrived not as a letter, but as a personal visit. Commissioner Hartley himself came, a tall, narrow man with a thin gray beard and the slightly harried manner of a man perpetually behind on his correspondence, and he sat at the kitchen table and accepted tea and said, with the careful circumlocution of officialdom, that there had been a development in the Article 14 situation. The Orc Elder Council, through their territorial advocate, had filed a formal challenge to the bondswoman contracts. The challenge was expected to take 3 to 6 months to work through the territorial court system, but preliminary assessment by the court's legal examiner was that Article 14 as written did not, in fact, legally permit human-to-orc transfer of persons, only property and goods, and that the clause had been implemented beyond its actual mandate. "What does that mean practically?" Benjamin asked. "It means the contracts may be voided. Not retroactively penalized, no one is in legal trouble for the implementation, but the remaining terms would be canceled. Anyone currently under an Article 14 bondswoman assignment would be, legally, free to go." Benjamin looked at Shagrol. She looked at him. "And if someone wished to remain," Benjamin said. Hartley blinked. "I'm sorry. If a person under an Article 14 contract did not wish to leave the assigned homestead when the contract was voided, if they chose freely to remain. Hartley looked between them with the expression of a man who had come prepared to manage a difficult situation and was finding the territory unexpectedly different from his map. That would be entirely their decision, he said slowly. There is no order of removal. If a person who had been assigned chose freely to remain in their current situation by their own election, the territorial office would have no grounds to intervene. Good, said Benjamin. He looked at Shagrol. She met his eyes with the calm surety of a woman who made her decisions from the inside out and gave him the small nod that was her particular form of yes. When Hartley had gone, they sat for a while in the kitchen and did not need to say much because most of what needed to be said had been said across the table in that brief exchange, and the rest of it lived between them in the clear, settled air of something decided. There is something I want to ask you, Benjamin said eventually. She raised her eyebrows. He pushed back his chair and came around the table and stood before her, and she looked up at him from her chair with dark eyes that were already reading him, had been reading him for months with increasing accuracy. He looked down at her with an expression that was in the territory of terrified and certain simultaneously, which she had come to understand as his particular location whenever something mattered intensely to him. I have nothing fancy to offer, he said. No ceremony that would be right for both of us. No ring that means anything in your tradition. But I have this land and everything on it and everything I know how to do and everything I am, and I am asking if you would be willing to build this life with me. All of it. Not as a bondswoman, not as a treaty assignment, as my wife. Because I want you here beside me because you want to be here, and because I would like to spend every winter and every harvest season and every morning argument about North Slope planting with you for the rest of my life. She looked at him for a long, absolutely still moment. You are not afraid, she said, of what it means, half-orc children, a clan woman's customs at the table, the town's opinion of it. I am only afraid of one thing, he said. What thing? That you'll say no. She stood from the chair, bringing herself to his eye level, and took his face in her hands the way she had that first night by the fire, and she looked at him with the full force of everything she was, the Ashbeak-born scout, the healer's daughter, the treaty's reluctant gift, the woman who had become something else entirely in the 9 months since the commissioner's wagon had delivered her to his property line, and she said, yes, Benjamin Dawson, yes. He wrapped his arms around her and held on, and she held on back, and outside the September field was gold in the late afternoon sun, and the horses were in the paddock, and the farmhouse stood solid and warm against the cooling sky, and everything was, at this moment, exactly as it should be. They married in October, when the leaves on the basin's edge trees had gone to red and gold, and the air was the kind of sharp and clear that made everything visible. They did it twice, in a sense. Once at the Thornwell magistrate's office with Sheriff Ostrander as witness and Petra Aldous, who had become Shagrol's first genuine friend in the settlement, as second witness, and once at the homestead at dawn the following morning, with a ceremony Shagrol conducted herself from her clan's tradition, which involved a spoken oath to the land and the hearth and the living person at her side. Conducted in Orcish while Benjamin stood beside her holding her hands and repeating the words she spoke to him, one by one, in a language he was just beginning to learn. Shagrol Earthshaker arrived 3 days before the ceremony, having traveled for 2 weeks from the Ashbeak with a group of clan members including Elder Vasha, who had arranged the travel with the territorial office's cautious blessing. He was enormous, broad as a doorframe, with his sister's dark eyes, and a laugh exactly as described seismic and warm and impossible not to respond to. He looked at Benjamin for approximately 4 minutes after being introduced, with the focused assessment of a large being determining threat level, and then he put one massive hand on Benjamin's shoulder and squeezed once and said, "My sister has good judgment. I see the reason for it now." Benjamin, who was trying very hard not to show that the shoulder squeeze had rattled his teeth, said, "Thank you, she does. Better than anyone I've met." Groth looked at his sister. "He is small," he observed in Orcish, which Benjamin did not yet fully understand. "He is enough," she replied, also in Orcish, and her tone had the particular warmth that made Groth make the rolling boulder laugh and pull her into a hug that lifted her off the ground briefly, which she allowed with exactly the resignation of someone who has always had a large younger brother. The clan delegation spent 4 days at the homestead, and in those 4 days, something happened to the property that was hard to name but easy to see. The presence of the Ashbeak orcs in the space, their voices and their fire building and their particular way of occupying a landscape with an ease and depth that came from long practice, transformed the homestead from Benjamin's place to something that was genuinely both of theirs, rooted equally in the basin soil and the Ashbeak tradition, and Benjamin felt it as a kind of completion he had not known to hope for. Several Thornwell settlers came out on the 3rd day, drawn by news that had spread through the basin's particular social telegraph, and they stood at the property line for a while with a mixed collection of expressions. Sheriff Ostrander came and shook hands with Elder Vasha with a formal respect that she returned precisely. Petra Aldis came and brought food and sat beside Groth by the fire and attempted to teach him a card game, which he took to with terrifying competence and won 3 consecutive hands. Even Old Man Farrett drove out, ostensibly to check on a supply arrangement with Benjamin, and stood near the wagon for a while watching the mixed gathering with an expression he eventually sorted out as something resembling wonder. The ceremony was beautiful in the particular way of things that are not planned for beauty, but achieve it through honesty. They stood together in the dawn field, the October light coming over the eastern hills in long amber bars, and they spoke their vows in both languages, Orcish and the frontier tongue, with Groth and Vasha and Ostrander and Petra around them and the horses visible in the paddock beyond, and the field, their shared, worked, argued over, beloved field stretching gold and stubble behind them. The winter that followed their marriage was the best winter of either of their lives. It was also a hard one by most practical measures, a prolonged freeze, 2 storms that came in back-to-back in February and kept them homestead-bound for 8 days, a sick cow that they nursed through 3 difficult nights, a split in the water barrel that required an emergency repair at 20 degrees below comfort. But they moved through all of it with the specific ease of 2 people who have found their stride together, who have learned each other's responses to pressure and fear and cold and exhaustion, and who have discovered that their respective strengths are not redundant, but complementary in the exact way a well-designed thing is complementary. She with her reading of land and weather and living systems. He with his structural instincts and his mechanical practicality, and his absolute refusal to quit anything he had started, and both of them with the deep, settled certainty of people who have chosen each other completely, and do not have to spend any of their energy wondering if the choice is right. They talked all that winter, in the long evenings by the fire, about everything about what they wanted to build, not just with the land but with their life. Whether they wanted to expand the homestead into something that could teach as well as produce, sharing what they knew with other basin settlers who were struggling with the same soil challenges. Whether they might, in time, build a more formal trading relationship with the Ashbeak clans, using the homestead as a kind of bridge, the orc knowledge of the regional ecology meeting the human settlement's distribution capacity. Whether there might be children and what those children would be and what they would carry forward from both of them. Half-orc children will have their own kind of difficulty in this world, Shagrol said one February night, honestly, looking at the fire. Every kind of person has their kind of difficulty, Benjamin said. What they'll have is 2 parents who love them and 2 heritages that between them know things that neither one alone does. She looked at him. You have thought about this. Since before I was willing to say it out loud, he admitted. She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about it too," she said, and I think our children would be extraordinary," she said simply. He reached over and put his hand on her face, the familiar tender gesture that had started that first night by the fire, and she leaned into it, and the February storm outside the walls was entirely irrelevant. In late March of their first year of marriage, Shagrol told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, before the day's work had properly begun, setting the information down on the table between them with the same directness she brought to all important things. He looked at her for a moment that stretched in the particular way of moments that contain large things, and then he stood from his chair and came around the table and held her face, and looked at her with an expression of such helpless, complete joy that she laughed out loud at the beauty of it and covered his hands with hers. The pregnancy was her domain in the way that anything requiring deep physical self-knowledge was her domain, and she managed it with the same competent practicality she brought to everything, continuing her work on the homestead through the spring planting with modifications born of experience. The heavier lifting redistributed, the longer treks cut shorter. The mornings given over to the particular nausea of early pregnancy, which she treated with the herbal knowledge her mother had left her, and which passed by the second month. She wrote to Elder Vasha, and Vasha wrote back with clan knowledge for the particular considerations of an orc pregnancy, some of which overlapped with general wisdom, and some of which was specific and valuable. She and Petra Aldous, who had 3 children of her own, talked at length about the forthcoming reality, and Petra became a kind of anchor in the Thornwell community, translating the pregnancy's visible progress into something the town could relate to and root for. The town was slowly doing exactly that. Not all of it. There were still people who crossed the road when Shagrol approached, and people who made their opinions audible in the tavern, and Garrick Sell remained a cold presence at the northern edge of the basin who had not apologized, and was not expected to. But the majority of Thornwell's residents had, over the course of a year, developed the specific practical respect that frontier communities often extend to people who are demonstrably excellent at what the community needs done, and Shagrol had been demonstrably excellent in ways that had spread through the basin's agricultural outcomes visibly enough to count. When Sheriff Ostrander stopped her in the road in June, visibly pregnant in the summer heat, to ask how the North Slope's second-year legume rotation was performing, and whether she thought the technique would work on the sandier soil of the Eastern Basin properties, and she spent 15 minutes explaining the soil chemistry considerations to him while he took careful notes, and 3 other settlers stopped to listen and ended up being invited into the conversation. It was one of those moments that is not dramatic on its surface, but that is, underneath, a profound shift in the tectonic plates of a community, the moment where an outsider becomes, almost despite everyone's intentions, a fixture, a person who belongs. Their son was born in early October, on a cool, clear evening when the same kind of red and gold light that had presided over their wedding was presiding over the fields. He was born in the farmhouse with Petra Aldous in attendance and Elder Vasha, who had traveled from the Ashpeak specifically for the occasion, and Benjamin, who held Shagrol's hand through the whole of it with the fierce, focused calm of a man who is not going to fall apart at the one time he needs most to be solid. The boy was born healthy and loud, and with the particular Earthshaker vitality that announced itself immediately and without apology. He had Shagrol's dark green skin and Benjamin's brown eyes, and the faint trace of his mother's tusks already visible in the configuration of his jaw, and he was the most beautiful and alarming thing either of his parents had ever seen. Benjamin held him first, because Shagrol, after the long labor, needed a moment to rest, and he stood with this new, yelling, miraculous person in his arms and looked at Shagrol with an expression she later told Petra she would carry inside her for the rest of her life. Something that was past joy, past love, past all the words that people use for large feelings, something that had no word because it was specific to this exact person, in this exact moment holding this exact child. "We need to name him," Shagrol said, reaching for the baby, and when Benjamin transferred him to her arms, the baby immediately stopped yelling and regarded her with the dark, unfocused seriousness of the newly born. "What was your father's name?" she asked. "Eli," Benjamin said. "Eli Dawson. And in the clan tradition we give a second name from the mother's line. My grandfather's name was Cragg." "Eli Cragg Dawson," Benjamin said, tasting the shape of it. The baby, as though an editorial comment, hiccuped with great dignity. "Perfect," Shagrol said, and looked up at Benjamin with the soft, shattered warmth of a woman who has just done the hardest and most profound thing she has ever done, and is still entirely present for all of it. Groth's letter arrived 12 days later. He had apparently been told by Vasha via a fast messenger that she had attended the birth, and he had composed the longest letter of their entire correspondence, which took Elder Vasha 2 pages to translate, and which was full of the particular mixture of joy and protective concern, and barely contained emotion that characterized everything Groth felt about his sister. And at the bottom of the translated page, Vasha had added a single note in her own small, precise script. "He cried for an hour when I told him. Do not tell him I said so. He would be mortified." Benjamin read the letter aloud at the kitchen table while Shagrol nursed Eli Cragg, and when he got to Vasha's postscript, she laughed so warmly and so freely that the baby startled, and then seemed to decide the sound was acceptable and settled again. The Article 14 challenge was formally decided by the territorial court in November of that year, 2 months after Eli Cragg's birth. The court held, as expected, that the bondswoman contracts had exceeded the treaty's actual mandate and were therefore void ab initio from the beginning. The remaining contracted individuals were freed, their records cleared, any wages held in trust released to them in full. Shagrol received a letter from the commissioner's office confirming that her contract was void and enclosing the wages that had been held in trust for 24 months, more money than she had expected, held conscientiously by an office that had otherwise managed the whole situation with considerable moral sloppiness. She set the letter on the kitchen table, and she and Benjamin read it together, Eli Cragg asleep in his cradle by the fire. "It's done," Benjamin said. "It was done a long time ago," she said. "This is just the paper catching up." She used the trust money, after a long conversation with Benjamin about it, to contribute to the homestead's first significant physical expansion, a proper stone addition to the farmhouse, 2 new rooms, because they would need the space, and a dedicated storage cellar with better insulation, and a second barn for the additional livestock they had been planning, and a small structure she called a teaching house, which she envisioned as a place where basin farmers could come to learn the soil and growing techniques she had been sharing informally for the past year. Benjamin matched her contribution with the proceeds from the harvest, which had again been the best in the basin. The teaching house was Shagrol's idea and her project and her particular pride, and it was also the thing that changed Thornwell's relationship with the homestead, and with her, in the most concrete and lasting way. It was a plain building, low and practical, with benches along the walls and a central table and shelves along one wall that held soil samples and dried plant specimens, and the careful notebooks in which she had documented her observations about the basin's agricultural potential over 2 years of daily attention. She opened it once a month, then twice, and settlers came skeptically at first, then with increasing openness, then with their neighbors in tow, then with their questions spilling over the sessions into letters and roadside conversations and invitations to come and look at a specific difficult plot. Garrick Sell came in the spring following Eli Cragg's birth. He came alone, without his ranch hands, on a quiet Thursday afternoon when no one else was there, and Shagrol was alone in the teaching house reorganizing the soil sample shelf. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she acknowledged him, giving him time to make the decision he was clearly working on. My cattle have been failing to hold weight through the winter, he said finally. 3 straight years. I've tried everything I know. Farrett said he stopped, tried again. He said you might know something about the forage crop situation on the western slopes. Shagrol looked at him steadily. She did not make him work for it more than he already was. She simply said, "Sit down, Garrick. Tell me about the slope's water drainage." They talked for an hour and a half. He left with 3 recommendations, and a small folded paper on which she had written the names of 2 forage varieties that would do what the current pasture grasses could not. He was not warm at the door, but he said thank you, and he meant it, and she accepted it in the same plain spirit. He came back the following month to report that the first variety had taken well and that he thought the cattle's condition was already improving. And in that visit, toward the end, he said, with the difficulty of a man dragging something heavy toward daylight, "I was wrong about you. Not about my family, the grief of that is true and it stays, but about you specifically. I was wrong." It was not an apology for everything, but it was an honest thing, and she received it honestly. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He nodded. He left. He was not Shagrol's friend, and he was not Benjamin's friend, but he was no longer their enemy. And in the economy of a frontier community, that is sometimes the most that can be asked of the hard years, and it was enough. Eli Cragg grew in the way of children who are deeply loved and actively curious, fast and loud and interested in everything. He was walking at 11 months and talking in both languages simultaneously at 14. He had his mother's instinct for the land and his father's stubborn practicality, and he was equally comfortable in the barn helping Benjamin with the horses, and in the kitchen garden watching Shagrol check the soil with her hands, and he watched both parents with the attentive, absorbing eyes of someone who understood, at some cellular level, that what he was watching was worth learning. Thornwell grew around them. The basin's population expanded as the territory's land office processed more homestead grants in the post-treaty years, and the new settlers who arrived found a community that was, if not entirely healed from its wartime divisions, at least further along the road of making something workable from what remained. Several of the new settler families had Orc spouses or mixed heritage, drawn by reports of what the Dawson homestead had demonstrated, that it was possible, that it was viable, that the land itself did not care about the divisions the people living on it had inherited. Shagrol's teaching house expanded. She took on an assistant, a young Orc woman named Dreka, who had come to the basin with her human partner, and who had a sharp, practical mind and a gift for explaining things clearly. Benjamin expanded the homestead's production capacity and began supplying seed stock to 3 neighboring properties, and the Dawson name became associated, in the basin's collective mind, not with the old controversy of Article 14, but with excellent wheat and honest dealing, and the teaching house on the south lot that had improved half the basin's yields. A second child arrived 3 years after Eli Cragg, a girl, smaller than her brother had been, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's green skin, and from the very first week, the particularly formidable quality of someone who has arrived in the world with a specific agenda. They named her Marin Vasha Dawson, the second name for Elder Vasha, who wept visibly when the letter arrived and sent back a gift, a set of hand-carved Orc counting beads that had belonged to Shagrol's mother. Benjamin held Marin on the porch of the expanded farmhouse on the evening of her 3rd day of life, looking out at the October fields going golden in the late light, and Shagrol stood beside him with her arm around his waist, and Eli Cragg sitting on the porch step below them with his small chin in his hands, considering the baby with the profound philosophical seriousness of a 3-year-old confronting a rival. "She is very loud," Eli Cragg said. "So were you," his mother said. "I was not," he said with great dignity. "You were profoundly loud," his father said. "You announced yourself to the entire basin." Eli Cragg appeared to consider whether this was a positive or negative quality, and ultimately decided it was probably fine. Benjamin turned to look at Shagrol, and she turned to look at him, And between them, the baby and the evening and the gold-lit field made the kind of scene that has no need of any narrative commentary, that is sufficient and complete in itself. His eyes had the soft, full look they got when he was most himself, not the careful man, not the working man, but the one she had found that first winter by the fire, the one who was afraid of only one thing. "I love our life," he said quietly. She pressed closer against him, her arm tightening around him. "So do I," she said. Profoundly. The years that followed were what years are when a foundation is solid, an ongoing building. Each season its own particular shape, with its difficulties and its graces, its losses small and large, its expansions and its deepenings. Shagrol Earthshaker finally made the long trip from the Ashpeak to stay for a full season when the children were 5 and 2, and he was so utterly captivated by Eli Cragg, who treated him as a natural ally and co-conspirator, that Shagrol joked that the two of them were going to undo everything she and Benjamin had built. And Groth accepted this accusation as a compliment and taught Eli Cragg 3 orc tracking songs that the boy sang at maximum volume for the remainder of the season, and that Benjamin quietly learned alongside him so that he could sing them too. Elder Vasha came the following summer and spent 3 weeks in the teaching house alongside Shagrol and Dreka, adding her considerable knowledge of the high country growing practices to the documentation they were building. And she and Benjamin had long evening conversations about the treaty's ongoing aftermath, and about what the Thornwell Basin might look like in 20 years if the current cautious rapprochement continued to deepen. Vasha was old and precise and deeply observant, and on her last evening she looked at Benjamin across the kitchen table with the evaluating gravity of someone who has made important assessments over a long lifetime, and she said, "You are a good man, Benjamin Dawson. You have been a good man in a way that mattered, which is rarer than the good intentions alone." He was quiet for a moment with the weight of it. "I just did what seemed right," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what I mean." The winter of their 7th year together was the mildest the basin had seen in memory, and they sat on the expanded porch on a February evening that felt like March, the children inside asleep, the fields dormant under their thin cover, the stars clear and particular above the dark hills. Shagrol had her feet on the porch rail and her tea on her knee, and Benjamin had his arm along the back of her chair, and the easy silence between them was the kind that only exists between people who have talked enough and deeply enough that the silence is not a gap but a continuation. "Do you ever think about what Harwick looked like?" she said. "When you told him to cut the rope?" "Occasionally," he said. "Why, I think about it sometimes, that moment, what you chose to do before you knew me at all, before I was anything to you except someone who had arrived in a difficult situation." He considered this. "You were a person," he said. "That was all I needed to know." She looked at him across the evening. "It was everything," she said. "That choice, it was the beginning of all of this." He reached over and took her hand, the familiar short gesture of 7 years, and she laced her fingers with his as she had that first night by the fire when the question had been whether to trust the feeling or the caution, and she had chosen the feeling and been right. The homestead was fully alive behind and around them, the teaching house's lamplight still faintly visible from the south window, the sound of Eli Cragg turning in his sleep somewhere in the new east room, the horses settled in the barn whose roof had long since been repaired and re-repaired, and which now stood solid against any weather the basin could produce. The kitchen garden was squared and ordered and ready for spring. The north slope was in its 7th year of improved soil production, rotating as Shagrol had always planned it, yielding more each cycle as the earth deepened its own capacity. The farmhouse had grown, room by room, into something that was neither fully the frontier human structure Benjamin had inherited nor the high-end stone architecture of the Ashpeak camps, but something that was its own specific third thing, shaped by both traditions and beholden to neither. That was what they had built between them finally. Not a compromise, not a midpoint, something new. In Thornwell the following spring, when the basin's annual planting festival was held on the main road, a new tradition, only 4 years old, that had grown from a small market day into something that pulled settlers from the entire basin's reach. Shagrol and Benjamin arrived together with the children, and the road was full of people and noise, and the particular energy of a community that has found something worth celebrating. Eli Cragg ran ahead to find the children of their neighboring homestead. Marin, old enough now to have opinions about everything and express them loudly, demanded to be shown the seed stalls immediately. Benjamin bought her a paper twist of honey candy from a stall near the trading post, which she accepted with the graciousness of royalty, and Shagrol shook her head at both of them, with the fond exasperation of a woman surrounded by people she loves completely. Sheriff Ostrander found them near the grain sample display and shook their hands and told them that the territorial governor's office had written to express interest in the Dawson homestead's soil improvement documentation as a potential model for agricultural development across the broader territory. There would be officials coming later in the summer to review the teaching house materials. Benjamin looked at Shagrol. Shagrol looked at Benjamin. "Tell them they are welcome," she said to Ostrander, with the calm, certain authority of someone who has long since established that this is her work and her domain. "We will be ready." They walked the festival road together in the afternoon light, her hand in his, the children orbiting them in the loose, cheerful pattern of children who are entirely secure in their orbit, and the people around them moved and greeted and nodded, and engaged in the natural, unguarded way of a community that has had time to see who someone is and to make its peace with it. Not every face was warm. The world did not perfect itself simply because love asked it to. But the majority of it was simply ordinary, which was the thing they had built toward and the thing that mattered most. The ordinary, unremarkable life of two people on a frontier homestead who loved each other and worked hard and had children who would carry forward something from both of them. As the sun went lower over the Thornwell Basin hills, and the festival's lanterns were lit, and Eli Cragg came back to his parents, holding a winning stone from a throwing contest with the proud breathlessness of the victorious young, and Marin climbed into Benjamin's arms and announced that she was tired and ready to go home, and that the festival had been adequate. Shagrol looked at the lantern light on her daughter's green face and her son's mixed heritage features and her husband's weathered, beloved, familiar face, and felt the full measure of what they had built as a single, enormous, gratitude-shaped thing moving through her chest. She had arrived at this homestead as war debt, a line item in a treaty signed by exhausted men who did not know what they were consigning her to. She had arrived with her wrists roped and her jaw set, and her heart already braced for the worst that human territory had in it. And then a man had told the deputy to cut the rope before he even knew her name, and he had told her she owed him nothing. And she had owed him nothing and given him everything anyway, because the giving was not a debt and had never been, but a choice, the same choice he had made before he knew anything about her except that she was a person and persons deserved to be treated as such. She thought about her mother, about the Ashbeak mornings, about Groth's rolling boulder laugh and Vash's precise script, and the smell of the kitchen garden in early spring, and the specific, irreplaceable warmth of Benjamin's hand in hers on a cold February night with the fire going, and the children asleep, and the whole long future of their life still ahead of them. She took his free hand as they walked toward the wagon in the gathering evening, past the lanterns and the traders and the neighbors who waved, and he looked over at her with the smile that had once transformed his face, and that she knew now, after all the seasons of it, as well as she knew the North Slope soil gradient or the sound of Thomas stamping in the early morning or the way this particular man said her name when he meant all of it, the whole of her, the earth and force together. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She held his hand and they went.